Gerald Jerry Tillinghast was once a name that carried weight in the underworld of Providence, Rhode Island. As a trusted enforcer for the Patriarcha crime family, he lived by a brutal code: loyalty above all, silence over truth, and violence as currency. For decades, he operated in the shadows, feared by many, known by few. To outsiders, he was a gangster. To insiders, he was reliable muscle. And to himself, he was surviving in a world that demanded ruthlessness. But survival came at a cost. After nearly 30 years behind bars for murder, Tillinghast emerged into a world that had moved on. The streets were different. The power he once wielded had faded. And for the first time, he began to reflect, not just on what he had done, but on who he had become. The man who once believed he was protecting his own by enforcing mob justice now faced a painful truth. His choices had destroyed lives, fractured families, and left him emotionally bankrupt. This moment of reckoning, when the identity he had built collided with the conscience he had buried, is a textbook example of cognitive dissonance. It's the psychological rupture that occurs when deeply held beliefs are confronted by undeniable evidence to the contrary. For Tillinghast, the belief that he was loyal, honorable, and necessary was shattered by the realization that he had been complicit in cycles of harm he could no longer justify. Rather than retreat into silence, Tillinghast chose to speak. He collaborated with a former police officer to write Choices, a memoir that exposed his bloody past. He appeared on podcasts and in interviews, not to reclaim notoriety, but to offer a warning. His story became a mirror for others trapped in the illusion of power, proof that even the most feared men can feel the weight of their past and seek redemption. Cognitive dissonance is not reserved for the guilty. It lives in the minds of artists, scientists, and saints. It is the ache of contradiction, the moment when a man's beliefs collide with his behavior, when the story he tells himself becomes unbearable. Leonardo da Vinci was a man of insatiable curiosity and deep reverence for life. He could articulate the very essence of compassion, beauty, and human elegance through every word he wrote into his art. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words. No matter where one goes in the world, all know the name of Leonardo, and in a strange way his immorality reminds us that we are all human and connects us all through the inspirational imprints that he still speaks through his surviving work. As if, in the moment we share being inspired or in awe by him, allows us to have a moment of world peace. Even though we may never share that moment as one world, his art speaks to us all, cutting trains of thought ever so effortlessly. To observe his work is to observe stillness in motion. It steals our worries and troubles. Yet at the same time, he also designed weapons, machines of war he claimed capable of mass destruction. In his notebooks, Leonardo justified these inventions as intellectual exercise or necessary commissions. But the tension was there. A man devoted to understanding life, contributing to its undoing. His dissonance was elegant, quiet, buried in sketches and marginalia. The genius who painted The Last Supper also engineered mass murderous melancholy mechanicals. How can one paint love and create destruction? The ego, acting as a psychological gatekeeper, strives to maintain coherence between self-image and behavior. But when actions contradict values or beliefs, cognitive dissonance erupts, forcing the ego to either rationalize or evolve. Intelligence refines this process, expanding the ego's capacity for self-awareness, emotional regulation, and moral reasoning, allowing it to adapt rather than defend. Yet when moral guidelines are bypassed or suppressed, the ego may distort reality to preserve its image, becoming the very source of dissonance it was meant to resolve. Leonardo's early works, like the Baptism of Christ, revealed technical brilliance and could incentivize a devout belief in Christ, but his gaze wandered to the exploration of how to kill effectively and efficiently. A sign of dissonance, an ego inflamed, a mind too expansive for the medium it was trained to please. By 1495, Leonardo began The Last Supper, a masterpiece born under constraint. The fresco technique failed him, but the composition did not. Each figure is a study in psychological rupture, gestures frozen in the moment of betrayal. Judas is not cast out or caricatured. He sits among the 12, hand reaching toward the same bowl as Christ, a gesture drawn directly from Scripture. His face is turned, his body angled away, but he is not theatrically isolated. The betrayal is present, but not yet complete. This ambiguity allows for reading through the lens of cognitive dissonance. the tension between proximity and rupture, between shared ritual and impending fracture. Judas's stillness contrasts with the chaos around him, cognitive dissonance in the act. Cognitive dissonance begins as a quiet ruptured signal that something within no longer fits. The brain responds not with clarity, but with choreography. First, the anterior cingulate cortex lights up, detecting conflict like a flare in the dark. It doesn't solve the tension. It marks the moment when belief and behavior collide. Then the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex begins its work, assembling plans, revisions, and rationalizations. This is the architecture of containment. The mind builds scaffolds not to escape the fracture, but to hold it in place. Planning intensifies. Thoughts loop. The executive system strains under the weight of contradiction, redirecting its energy toward structure instead of resolution. As the dissonance deepens, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex steps in, where emotion and value meet. Here, the brain begins to weigh the cost of change. What must be lost to become someone new? What must be felt to stop pretending? This is the threshold. Gerald Tillinghast crossed it in prison, choosing confession over concealment. Each apostle in the Last Supper reacts to Christ's words with a different gesture of disbelief, protest, or grief. But it is Judas who anchors the fracture. He is not cast in shadow, nor theatrically exiled. He is embedded in the scene, hand reaching toward the same bowl as Christ. The act that caused the famous dissonance of mankind is occurring, and yet his expression is unreadable, a sign of his current ignorance to understand the severity of what is to come. Gerald and Judas represent two distinct responses to dissonance. Gerald encountered contradiction and chose to engage it through structure, documenting moral tensions, refining ethical boundaries, and using recursive planning to stabilize his role within a shifting ecclesiastical landscape. His penance reflects a mind actively metabolizing conflict. Judas, by contrast, experienced rupture without containment. The Gospel accounts describe a descent into despair following his betrayal, culminating in suicide. This outcome illustrates the psychological toll of unresolved dissonance, when executive function cannot reconcile internal fracture, and emotional regulation fails to restore coherence. Gerald's path reflects adaptive integration through symbolic design, while Judas's collapse underscores the necessity of narrative repair. Dissonance, left unprocessed, can destabilize identity. It can be deadly, but given structure, it can initiate transformation. Gerald's legacy is not one of moral clarity, but of moral confrontation. His penitentials do not offer a clean theology. They reveal a man wrestling with contradiction, codifying sin while acknowledging its recurrence. In this, Gerald used dissonance as a tool for refinement. His engagement with ethical fracture, through writing, revision, and ritual, allowed him to metabolize conflict into structure. He did not falter to his dissonance, he worked within it, allowing the tension between doctrine and human behavior to shape a more adaptive moral architecture, one that later served the church. Judas, by contrast, encountered dissonance as rupture without repair. His betrayal, once enacted, severed him from the community that might have held the fracture with him. The Gospel accounts offer no evidence of narrative reconstruction, only despair, isolation, and death. This divergence illustrates the critical role of containment, narrative access, and symbolic processing in the aftermath of moral injury. Dissonance, when engaged recursively, can become a site of transformation. When left unintegrated, it risks becoming terminal. To forgive yourself is not to forget, it is to resequence. Mistakes are not anomalies in the human experience, they are evidence of it. The brain, under stress or distortion, may act in ways that violate personal values. Self-forgiveness begins when executive function stops looping through justification and begins planning for repair. The anterior cingulate cortex signals the conflict. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex weighs the cost of change. Mistakes are inevitable. What matters is how they are metabolized. When the mind is allowed to feel, reflect, and reframe without suppression, the fracture becomes functional. Shame loses its grip. Planning becomes purposeful. The narrative shifts from containment to transformation. Self-forgiveness is not weakness. It is the disciplined act of honoring the signal, repurposing the plan, and choosing coherence over collapse. Cognitive dissonance, growth-oriented mental fatigue, and harmful activity selection represent distinct psychological and neurological phenomena with markedly different implications for self-development. Distinguishing these three are essential because of the striking experiential. Mental fatigue that promotes growth is a temporary state of cognitive strain resulting from sustained effort in learning, emotional processing, or ethical reflection. Though exhausting, this form of fatigue reflects adaptive overload and can lead to neuroplasticity, emotional resilience, and executive strengthening when paired with recovery. It is a sign that the brain is remodeling itself under meaningful stress. Harmful activity selection, however, operates differently. It involves repeated behaviors that overstimulate or degrade neural systems, such as compulsive scrolling, substance abuse, or chronic multitasking, and often bypass reflective engagement altogether. These behaviors overactivated reward circuitry while suppressing executive function and fragmenting memory systems, leading to desensitization, impulse dysregulation, and diminished capacity for self-regulation. The body may register them as agitation, restlessness, or even numbness. But beneath that shared surface, their mechanisms and outcomes diverge. Cognitive dissonance feels like internal contradiction. Your values and actions are misaligned, and your brain begins looping through rationalizations or avoidance. Growth-oriented fatigue, on the other hand, emerges from sustained effort in learning, reflection, or emotional processing. It can feel just as exhausting, but it's often paired with a sense of purpose or breakthrough. Harmful activity selection can mimic both states. But don't be fooled. It may feel like relief or distraction, but neurologically it bypasses integration and erodes executive function over time. So yes, they can feel similar in the body and mind, but the difference lies in trajectory. The wrong activity selection has no real use in the outcome and can even be cause to cognitive behavioral decline. Safety sweet spot. Neurodiversity acknowledges that cognitive and emotional processing vary across individuals, shaped by genetics, sensory thresholds, and neural architecture. Conditions such as ADHD, autism, and sensory processing differences alter perception, attention, and relational engagement in ways that traditional therapeutic models often overlook. Trauma history adds another layer, modifying threat detection, emotional regulation, and relational safety. These internal variables do not exist in isolation. They are amplified or buffered by ecological context. Home dynamics, cultural norms, community structures, and sensory environments all modulate the nervous system's baseline. A child in a chaotic household may require low-stimulation rituals to stabilize stimulation, while an adult in a culturally affirming space may thrive through symbolic storytelling and relational mirroring. In contrast, a neurodivergent teen may benefit from symbolic immersion paired with structured autonomy, activities that allow for emotional depth without overwhelming executive function. The NSD-driven concept of social stimulation, use of the regional brain matrix correlated to real-life experiences and psychosocial activities, helps assess these variables in real time, ensuring that each intervention is emotionally congruent, neurologically safe, and developmentally aligned. Social stimulation becomes therapeutic when it reflects the client's lived experience. Development, in this framework, is not a linear path, but a responsive ecosystem shaped by the interplay of brain, body, and environment. The matrix helps guide human attunement, ensuring that every intervention honors the complexity of the person it serves. Somatic regulation, the body's ability to modulate stimulation through breath, movement, and interoception, works in tandem with relational safety. These systems are intertwined. Safe relationships promote somatic regulation, and regulated bodies are more open to connection. Co-regulated dialogue, mirroring, and predictable relational cues, such as tone, packing, and proximity, activate the social engagement system, while breathwork, tactile stimulation, and gentle movement help stabilize the autonomic nervous system. Together, they create the conditions for emotional recalibration and neural integration. It creates internal safety. Yet safety, while foundational, carries a paradox. Emotional safety is the entry point for regulation and integration, but oversecurity can become a developmental trap. When environments become overly controlled, predictable, or emotionally padded, they may inadvertently suppress the very conditions that foster growth, resilience, and identity formation. The brain thrives on safe risk, experiences that stretch capacity without overwhelming it. Moderate stress, when buffered by relational attunement, activates neuroplasticity, strengthens adaptive coping, and deepens self-awareness. Oversecure environments, though well-intentioned, can lead to stagnation. Rigid routines, excessive emotional buffering, and avoidance of challenge may reduce anxiety, but also impair autonomy, exploratory behavior, and emotional flexibility. This paradox is especially relevant in therapeutic and educational settings, where practitioners may unintentionally shield individuals from the emotional friction that catalyzes transformation. One who is never invited to confront relational tension may struggle to build trust or assert boundaries. A student protected from failure may miss opportunities to develop grit and reflective capacity. The brain stimulation matrix addresses this by prescribing calibrated challenge, activities that evoke emotional tension within a container of safety and symbolic meaning. These tasks stretch the nervous system without snapping it, using novelty, social negotiation, and symbolic engagement to activate growth pathways. Growth does not emerge from perfect comfort. It arises in attuned tension, where the brain is stretched, the identity is refined, and the self is reclaimed. Safe risk is the developmental sweet spot between comfort and chaos, a zone where emotional friction leads to integration rather than fragmentation. In the NSD framework, designing for safe risk means introducing challenges that stretches the nervous system without overwhelming it. This requires precision. Activities must evoke novelty, effort, and emotional tension, but within a relationally secure and symbolically meaningful container. The goal is not to provoke distress, but to activate the brain's adaptive systems, those involved in executive function, emotional regulation, and social cognition, through intentional engagement. Diagnosis-informed and trauma-sensitive self-development planning. This section outlines how the NSD framework supports the design of individualized self-development plans grounded in diagnostic insight and trauma sensitivity. Psychological conditions, such as depression, PTSD, ADHD, and anxiety, are understood through their neural signatures, allowing practitioners to map dysregulation to specific brain regions and functional systems. These mappings inform the selection and sequencing of interventions that aim to re-engage underactive circuits, modulate overactive ones, and restore coherence across emotional, cognitive, and relational domains. Trauma-sensitive design adds a second layer of calibration. It accounts for emotional thresholds, sensory sensitivities, and relational readiness, ensuring that each intervention respects the client's lived experience and neurobiological capacity. The framework includes tools for identifying trauma flags, developmental gaps, and ecological stressors, guiding practitioners in packing engagement and building tolerance without triggering collapse. The matrix functions as a planning tool, not just for therapeutic activity selection, but for structuring developmental trajectories. It helps practitioners assess neural readiness, emotional congruence, and contextual fit, enabling interventions that are both biologically aligned and psychologically attuned. The goal is not symptom suppression, but strategic growth, moving from fragmentation to integration, from dysregulation to resilience, through intentional, relational, and neurologically informed design. Creativity operates inside the same networks that manage adaptation, regulation, and action. It is a process that reorganizes memory, sensation, and perception into new configurations that work: solutions, gestures, artifacts, strategies. Creativity appears when the nervous system must translate feeling into form and chaos into sequence. It shows up in improvisation, in a quick retort that disarms an aggressor, in a repair workaround that keeps a project alive, and in a painting that reframes grief. Creativity is not a decorative add-on. It is a mechanism for holding complexity together. Psychology, too, often isolates creativity as some exotic faculty separate from the everyday machinery of thought. That separation masks what matters: creative work is intelligence in motion. It recruits fluid reasoning, emotional calibration, pattern recognition, and symbolic fluency and binds them to executive sequence. In practice, this means creativity modulates feeling so cognition can proceed. It turns ambiguity into handholds. It arranges experience so action follows. The creative mind adapts by recombining what already exists into configurations that carry meaning and function. Seen this way, creativity functions as structure. It contains effect so decisions can be made. It organizes perception so attention can land usefully. It produces symbols that reorder identity. It is a universal capacity, not an elite privilege. The capacity to invent and reframe is how organisms persist with complexity intact. When creativity is tethered to regulation, it produces coherence. When it untethers, when vanity, habit, or ambition sever practice from purpose, it produces spectacle and self-deception. Leonardo, the illusion of mastery. In the early 1500s, Leonardo returned to Florence and Rome trailing reputation like perfume, seductive, but ultimately vaporous. He entered courts and workshops not as a craftsman, but as a conjurer of attention. He built stage effects for pageants, designed water clocks that never kept time, and sketched ideal cities that were drowned in myth like Alexandria. His notebooks ballooned with mirrored writing, speculative devices, and symbolic dissections of thought, many of which were never tested, popping before his very eyes. He traded execution for spectacle and patrons for props. What he offered was not mastery, but momentum. He kept others circling his orbit, dazzled by the promise of genius while he quietly evaded its demands. Was he just a dazzler? A fraud facading feats from functional faculty? Leonardo's public work functioned as camouflage. He didn't share process, he staged it. He curated perception like a magician guards his sleight of hand. Was his optical tricks and mechanical sketches instruments of delay, a diversion to the theft taking place? He stole the hearts and admiration of everyone but was ill intent present, a deliberate delusion to paint himself as more than we are capable of. He manufactured complexity to avoid accountability. Where craft requires closure, he preferred the ambiguity of endless iteration. This wasn't absent-mindedness, it was strategy. Keep the audience guessing, and you never have to deliver the final act. Even his emotional intelligence, so often praised, was embedded in avoidance. His paintings withheld more than they revealed. In St. John the Baptist, the smirk is not invitation, it's deflection. In La Scapigliata, the unfinished hair and vacant gaze suggest not mystery, but abandonment. An abandonment he was content with. These were not portraits of people, they were portraits of retreat. Leonardo encoded effect into posture and shadow, but refused completion. The viewer is invited to marvel, not to understand. His intelligence was magnetic, yes, but it repelled intimacy. He built emotional architecture without ever stepping inside. Across this period, abundance and failure were inseparable. He proposed systems, hydraulic, theatrical, symbolic, that teased coherence but rarely delivered it. The reason his work was rarely commissioned. The grandeur of his name conceals a chronic defect, an addiction to possibility that displaced the labor of completion. He was not a master of painting, engineering, or anatomy. He was a master of beginnings, a virtuoso of deferral. His legacy is not one of finished works, but of unfinished wagers. Leonardo's intelligence was real, but it was evasive. He opened doors and then walked away, leaving others to admire the gateways. And yet, for all his evasions, Leonardo left behind a question that refuses to settle. What is creativity, really? The capacity to conjure what does not yet exist to its completion. His failures, though maddening, point to something essential, an intelligence that resists domestication. Defiance. Like a movie, his complete work was the extras, versions of his creativity that contradicted his lifestyle. Not the tidy intelligence of answers, but the unruly kind that multiplies questions. In this light, his unfinished machines and vanishing spectacles become less evidence of negligence and more like early tremors of a deeper possibility. That intelligence, unbound from completion, might serve as a generative force in its own right. Here, creativity begins to resemble a kind of philosophical extroversion, not merely social expressiveness, but a structural impulse to externalize thought, to test the world by projecting into it. What if the mind's highest function is not to solve, but to extend? To reach outward with symbols, systems, and spectacles that provoke response. From this vantage, we turn from the Renaissance workshop to the speculative horizon, where intelligence is no longer a trait, but a terrain mapped not by what it knows, but by what it dares to imagine. Is it the impulse to externalize thought, to test reality by projecting into it? Did Da Vinci reach outward to connect, or to escape the confines of internal silence? What happens when the drive to share exceeds the capacity to finish? Does that make us evasive or expansive? Is the mind's highest function to solve problems or to provoke response? Sci-fi humanity. It's a question science may never fully answer. Intelligence isn't just a metric or a trait, it's a mystery, a force, a phenomenon that seems to arise from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. I've caught myself doing things toward my own betterment instinctually, without planning or deliberation. For example, when someone tries to be nasty, before I even register their intent, I've already responded with a smooth, witty remark that blends seamlessly into the conversation. Only noticing it in retrospect. It's not rehearsed. It's not calculated. It's instantaneous, arriving at the beat of a thought. And all do this. All ruminate the remnants of image of God. We all have this ability. The mind-body system protects itself cognitively and physically through biological responses we often don't notice until after the fact. Reflexes, micro-decisions. Emotional pivots, they emerge from somewhere beneath the surface. So where does that come from? Because in moments like a quick rebuttal to a cruel comment, it seems impossible for the individual to consciously construct such a response. And yet, it happens. There are countless theories about intelligence: emotional, social, symbolic, executive. But the kind I find most relevant to a chapter titled The Creative, especially in the context of social stimulation, is what I call embedded instinct. It is intelligence that lives in the body, in the habits, in the reflexes. In a negative perspective, impulse. Our impulses themselves can be trained. It's the kind that doesn't ask permission from the prefrontal cortex, it just acts. Let's step away from science for a moment and enter a realm where superhuman ability is possible. Through self-actualization and habitual embedment, we can train instinct to behave intelligently. In a perfect case, a person could not only overcome their limitations, but develop methods so refined they become nature. They could embed what we consider the most intelligent human habits, empathy, timing, restraint, creativity, into their very being. Instincts like Agent 47 from Hitman. Instinct like command over adrenaline-fueled strength that lets someone lift a compact car in a crisis. A dystopian sci-fi reality. Adaptiveness is inherent to life. Whether that design was intelligent or accidental is up to debate, but the fact that humanity considers itself intelligent is undeniable. Every form of intelligence we recognize, human, animal, artificial, contains behaviors and habits. So just as we dissolve chemicals to uncover their compounds, we can deconstruct what is considered intelligent human behavior and replicate it. The key is repetition over longitudinal training. The only thing we truly lack is time, and the white coats are getting better at expanding that. We're living longer than ever. I think humanity has entered an era where we must learn how to live longer, because consider human history. This is all new to our genetic code. There's a sci-fi theory that if you change your habits well enough, if you embed intelligent behaviors deeply enough, you can alter your epigenetic code. You could pass on superior traits through nurture and nature. In theory, over generations, we could see a race whose intelligence far surpasses our brightest minds today. The waters are warm for this kind of evolution, thanks to technologies like AI. But technology can either break us or make us. In theory, one could choose the level of intelligence your lineage inherits. But no one is perfect. My own parents broke my heart, and I still consider them the best parents on the face of the earth. Let's consider what it means to develop the world. It's simpler than most think, at least for researchers and scientists. Look at the